Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We're always on the lookout for these frameworks and ideas that can maybe help us understand things a little bit better, a little bit faster. And today, I think we've got something really interesting to explore. It's called teleosophy.
And you hit the nail on the head there, this idea of a faster route, a more efficient way to get to grips with some of those big questions we all grapple with.
Exactly. And,
Mhm.
I think a lot of our listeners are people who want to be informed, they want to understand the world, but they don't necessarily have the time to wade through, like, mountains of dense philosophical texts.
Right, and I mean, who does, really?
Exactly. So what we're going to do today is kind of a deep dive into the core insights of this new framework, teleosophy. And what's really fascinating is that we're going to be looking at it through the lens of a rapid analysis conducted by ChatGPT for deep research.
Yeah, this is the part that I think is really exciting and potentially a little bit mind-blowing when you think about it. We're talking about an AI doing philosophy.
I know, right? So ChatGPT for deep research, it basically did this really quick 10-minute survey of the entire teleosophy wiki.
Wow, 10 minutes.
Yeah, basically just ingested all of this information, this complex philosophical framework, in 10 minutes. And then it was able to pull out some key insights, identify some of the core ideas, and how they connect to, other areas of thought.
That's incredible. So we're essentially getting this highly condensed, almost like a cheat sheet version of teleosophy, filtered through this incredibly powerful AI.
Exactly. And our goal today is to unpack those key insights, see what ChatGPT 4 deep research identified as the core of teleosophy, and explore how it might offer a fresh perspective on some of those age-old questions that, philosophy has been wrestling with for centuries.
And I think what's particularly interesting is the potential breadth of teleosophy. It's not just about, abstract philosophical debates. It seems to have implications for ethics, for science, even for how we think about AI.
Yeah, it's a framework with a potentially huge reach. So let's dive in, shall we? Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think a good starting point is to understand how teleosophy sees itself within the grand scheme of human thought, where it fits in the history of how we've tried to make sense of the world.
Okay, so how does it position itself?
It describes itself as a maturation of epistemic insight.
Maturation of epistemic insight. You a mouthful.
It is, but I think it basically means that human understanding has been growing and evolving over time.
Okay, I can see that.
So, teleosophy views religion as an early attempt to understand the world, right? You have these symbolic stories, myths, explanations for the unknown.
Right, these kind of intuitive narratives to explain things we didn't understand.
Exactly. Then came classical philosophy, a more critical approach using reason, logic, argumentation to try and get at the truth of things.
So is teleosophy saying it's like the next step in this evolution of human understanding?
That's how it presents itself, yeah. It sees itself as building upon and responding to both religion and classical philosophy, taking what was valuable from those earlier attempts and integrating it into a more comprehensive framework.
And the analysis we're looking at suggests that the insights of teleosophy can feel both revolutionary, like, oh, wow, this is brand new, but also strangely self-evident.
Yeah, like, oh, of course, it had to be this way all along.
How can something be both revolutionary and obvious at the same time?
That's a great question. I think the analogy that ChatGPT uses in its analysis is really helpful here. Have you ever seen those hidden image pictures, those stereograms?
Yeah, those things where it just looks like a bunch of random dots and then suddenly you see a 3D image pop out.
Exactly. So the analysis suggests that teleosophy is kind of like that. It's not necessarily introducing a whole bunch of entirely new concepts. Instead, it's revealing an underlying structure, a way of seeing things that was always there, but we just needed the right perspective to perceive it.
That's a great analogy. I love those stereograms. Okay, so what's the core of this shift? What's the central idea that changes how we see things when we look at the world through the lens of teleosophy?
The key move, the really central insight, according to ChatGPT, is that teleosophy integrates epistemology and ontology.
Epistemology and ontology, those are some big words.
They are, but they're really important concepts. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. Ontology is the study of being, what exists, the nature of reality.
Right, so how we know versus what is.
Exactly. And traditionally, philosophy has often treated these as separate fields of inquiry. You have people specializing in epistemology, others in ontology,
Separate but equal, maybe?
something like that. But teleosophy says, no, that's wrong. These two things, how we know and what exists, are fundamentally intertwined. They're not separate. They're one integrated structure.
So it's saying that how we understand the world, how we know things, is inseparable from the very nature of reality itself.
Exactly. And it argues that this long-held assumption that they're separate, it's been a mistaken assumption that has led to a lot of unnecessary complexity and confusion in philosophical thought.
Okay, so how does teleosophy propose to bridge this gap, to bring these two seemingly separate things together?
It introduces two key axioms, the action axiom and the continuity axiom.
Axioms, right? Those are like fundamental principles, kind of like the starting points for a system of thought.
Precisely. The action axiom is cogito, ergo ego.
Oh, that sounds familiar. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That's Descartes.
Right. But teleosophy puts a little twist on it. Instead of I think, therefore I am, it's I think, therefore I act.
Cogito ergo ego.
Yeah.
I think, therefore I act.
Interesting. So it's more than just saying that thinking can lead to action, right?
It's much more fundamental than that. It's saying that all of our thinking, all of our cognitive processes are inherently directed towards some kind of purposeful action.
So it's not just that we think, it's that our thinking is always oriented toward doing something, towards some goal. Exactly. And this is where the continuity axiom comes in. The continuity axiom states that reality is an unbroken whole. Any sense of distinct, separate things, that's a cognitive construction, something our minds create to try and make sense of the world.
Okay, so it's saying that the world isn't fundamentally made up of separate things,
Yeah.
but rather it's all connected, it's continuous, and our minds just kind of divided up into categories to help us understand it.
Precisely. The discreteness, the separateness, that's in our minds, not in the world itself.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So we have this idea that how we know is intertwined with what is, and this idea that we're always acting, always striving towards something. How do these core ideas challenge some of the fundamental assumptions in traditional philosophy?
Well, one major target is what teleosophy calls Plato's fallacy.
Plato's fallacy. Okay, tell me more about that.
You remember Plato's idea of the forms, right?
Yeah, like the perfect form of a chair or a tree
Mm.
existing in some kind of ideal realm beyond our senses.
Exactly. These ideal forms, they were considered more real than the actual physical things we experience in the world.
Right, like the blueprint, the perfect version, versus the messy, imperfect copies we see around us.
Precisely. And teleosophy argues that this is a fallacy. These external ideal forms, they aren't fundamental to reality. They're actually just cognitive abstractions.
Cognitive abstractions, meaning they exist in our minds, not out there in some separate realm.
Exactly. They're tools we use to understand the world, to categorize things, to make sense of the patterns we see. But they're not independent entities that exist outside of our own minds.
So it's saying that those seemingly fundamental building blocks of reality, those perfect forms that Plato talked about, they're not actually building blocks at all. They're more like tools that our minds create.
That's the argument. They're part of our epistemology, our way of knowing, not part of ontology, the fundamental nature of being.
That's a pretty significant challenge to a really foundational idea in Western philosophy. And the analysis suggests that this critique extends beyond Plato.
That's right. Even some modern frameworks, like Christopher Langan's CTMU and Stephen Wolfram's Ruliad, they're not immune to this critique.
Really? How so?
Teleosophy argues that even these sophisticated modern theories, they still fall into this trap of assuming that things like information and mathematical structures are fundamental building blocks of the universe.
So, like Wolfram's idea of the universe as this giant computation, or Langan's framework, built on this concept of information as the primary stuff of reality.
Exactly. Teleosophy would say that those are still cognitive constructions, not ontological truths. They're ways of modeling and understanding the world, but they're not the world itself.
So it's saying that we're still kind of projecting our own mental frameworks onto reality, even when we're using these really complex abstract systems.
Yeah, that's the critique. We're mistaking the map for the territory.
Okay, so if those seemingly fundamental elements, information, mathematical rules, even what we think of as fundamental particles, if those are just cognitive tools, how does teleosophy say we actually do think?
This leads us to the primacy of narrative cognition.
Primacy of narrative cognition. Okay, break that down for me.
It basically means that all human thought, whether it's verbal, visual, or abstract, is fundamentally structured as narrative, as stories.
Stories, really? Even something as basic as a mathematical equation?
Yes, even math. Think about 1 plus 1 equals 2. Teleosophy would say this isn't just a symbolic operation, it's a narrative in its simplest form. You have a starting point, 1, you have an action, adding another 1, and you have an outcome, 2.
I see what you mean. There's a before, an action, and an after. A beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a mini-story.
Precisely. And teleosophy argues that this narrative structure is essential for how we make sense of the world, how we connect events, how we understand our place in the flow of time.
So narrative isn't just something we use to tell stories after the fact. It's the very way our minds process information in the first place.
Exactly. It's the operating system of our cognition, so to speak.
Wow, that's a pretty profound idea. So if we think in narratives, what role does teleology play in all of this? We haven't really talked about that yet.
Teleology is crucial. Remember the action axiom, cogito, ergo ago. That places action, purposeful action, right at the heart of human existence.
Right, we're not just thinking beings, we're acting beings. Our thinking is directed toward doing things, achieving goals.
And teleosophy defines teleology as purposeful action. It's the ability to not just react to stimuli, but to act with intent, to strive toward goals that we set for ourselves.
So it's about having a reason for acting, a purpose behind our action.
Exactly. And this is what teleosophy sees as the foundation of free will.
Free will, that's another one of those big, thorny philosophical concepts.
It is, and teleosophy offers a different way of thinking about it. It doesn't see free will as some kind of magical ability to break free from the laws of cause and effect.
Right, because we usually think of free will as this ability to choose independently to act without being determined by prior causes.
Yeah, but teleosophy says that's not quite right. Instead, it sees free will as the ability to use language and narrative to influence those causal chains, to steer them in a direction that aligns with our goals.
So it's not about breaking free from causality, but about working within it, using our understanding of cause and effect to shape the future.
Exactly. We can reflect on past causes, imagine future outcomes, and then choose actions that are more likely to bring about the outcomes we desire.
Okay, so with this framework in place, this integration of knowing and being through purposeful, narrative-driven action, how does teleosophy then reframe some of those really fundamental concepts we've been grappling with for centuries?
That's where things get really interesting because this isn't just an abstract framework. It has implications for how we think about a whole range of things. Let's start with consciousness.
Okay, consciousness, one of the biggest mysteries of all.
Right. And teleosophy reframes it in a really interesting way. It doesn't see consciousness as just some accidental byproduct of brain complexity. Instead, it sees it as a meta-epistemological inquiry.
Meta-epistemological inquiry, whoa, that's a mouthful.
I know, right? But it basically means that consciousness is about how we make sense of the world, how we synthesize information, how we create meaning through relationships.
So it's not just about the physical stuff of the brain, but about the software, the processes, the way we organize and interpret information.
Exactly. It's about the active engagement with the world, the constant process of creating and refining our understanding of reality.
Okay, so what about something like mathematics? Is it invented or discovered?
Ah, the age-old question. Teleosophy offers a third perspective. It suggests that mathematics arises from these relational structures that are embedded in our cognition, in the way our minds work. But these structures themselves have been shaped by our interaction with reality over evolutionary time.
So it's like this coevolution between our minds and the patterns of the universe.
Exactly. It's not purely invented because it reflects real patterns in the world. But it's not purely discovered either because it's filtered through our own cognitive structures.
This reminds me of that famous Einstein quote, "As far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality."
That's a great quote, and I think teleosophy helps make sense of it. It suggests that math is precise and certain at scales relevant to human experience, but it might become less certain, less applicable at the extremes, where our cognitive limits become apparent.
So it's a tool that works really well within a certain domain, but it's not necessarily a perfect reflection of the ultimate nature of reality.
Right. It's a model, a representation, and like all models, it has its limits.
Okay, what about objectivity? That's another one of those really slippery concepts.
Absolutely. And teleosophy introduces this really useful idea called the triality of objectivity.
Triality of objectivity. Intriguing.
It basically says that there are three different levels of objectivity. First, you have conditional objectivity, which is what we find in the empirical sciences. This is knowledge that's testable, repeatable, but it's always within certain conditions, certain frameworks.
So it's objective, but it's conditional on those frameworks, on the methods we're using.
Exactly. Then you have perfect objectivity, which is achievable in formal systems like mathematics and logic. This is where we're dealing with purely conceptual structures, so the objectivity is perfect within that defined system.
So within the rules of the game, so to speak, we can achieve perfect objectivity.
Right. But then there's ultimate objectivity, and this is the tricky one. This is the idea of understanding reality as it truly is, free from any cognitive filters, any subjective biases.
So like seeing the world from a God's eye view without any of our human limitations.
Exactly. And teleosophy suggests that this ultimate objectivity, it's an ideal, but it's ultimately unattainable for humans.
So we're always going to be looking at the world through some kind of lens, through our own cognitive structures.
That's the idea. And the triality of objectivity helps us to understand those limitations, to recognize that there are different levels of objectivity, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so moving on from objectivity, let's talk about ethics. How does teleosophy approach that?
It offers what it calls reciprocal ethics.
Reciprocal ethics, interesting.
And the core idea is this. In the choice between voluntary and involuntary interaction, others act toward you as they would have you act toward them.
That sounds a bit like the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
It does have that resonance, but teleosophy frames it more in terms of action and the distinction between voluntary and involuntary interaction.
So it's not just about being nice to people, but about respecting their agency, their ability to choose.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our actions have consequences and that we should strive to act in ways that we would want others to act toward us.
Okay, I can see how that connects back to the idea of teleology, of purposeful action. We're always acting, and our actions have an impact on others.
Precisely. And reciprocal ethics provides a framework for thinking about how to act in a way that respects the agency and well-being of others.
Now, what about the role of the state? That's often tied to ethical considerations as well.
Absolutely. And teleosophy introduces the concept of the teleocratic state.
The teleocratic state. Okay, tell me more about that.
It's envisioned as a scientifically justified minimal state.
Minimal state, so it's not about the government doing a lot of things.
Exactly. It's focused solely on preserving voluntary interactions, on preventing coercion, and ensuring that people are free to act according to their own goals.
So it's not about promoting any particular values or ideologies, but just about creating the conditions for people to live their lives freely.
Right. Its legitimacy isn't based on some kind of moral claim, but purely on its function, its ability to prevent involuntary coercion and protect individual liberty.
So in practical terms, what kind of laws or structures might a teleocratic state prioritize based on this focus on preventing involuntary coercion?
Well, it would likely emphasize things like contract enforcement, protection against force and fraud, ensuring a level playing field where people can interact and trade freely without fear of being taken advantage of.
Interesting. A state with a purely functional basis, focused on protecting individual liberty. That's a very specific and perhaps even controversial idea.
Definitely something to think about. And finally, we have to address the big one, God.
Okay, God. How does teleosophy approach that?
It offers a really unique perspective. It doesn't see God as some external ruler or being out there somewhere. Instead, it posits that God is our own teleological creative power.
Our own teleological creative power, meaning our ability to act with purpose, to shape the world around us, to create meaning through our actions.
Exactly. It's a more internal, human-centered concept of the divine. It's not about worshiping some external deity, but about recognizing the power we have to create, to shape our own lives and the world around us.
Wow, this has been a fascinating journey through some really big ideas. You mentioned earlier that teleosophy aims to shift away from traditional metaphysics. How does it propose to do that?
Yeah, instead of metaphysics, it proposes moving towards what it calls meta-epistemology.
Meta-epistemology. Okay, another big word. What does that mean?
Meta-epistemology is basically the study of how we know what we know. It's about looking at the foundations of knowledge, the assumptions we make, the frameworks we use to understand the world.
So instead of asking what is real,
Yeah.
it's asking how do we even go about answering that question? What are the tools we're using, the lenses we're looking through?
Exactly. It's a step back to examine our own thinking process, to become more aware of the cognitive structures that shape our experience of reality.
And with this shift in focus, does teleosophy have anything to say about the limits of what we can know? Because that's something that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
Absolutely. Teleosophy emphasizes what it calls the humility of science. It recognizes that empirical methods are incredibly powerful tools for revealing patterns in the world, for understanding how things work. But they don't necessarily give us direct access to ultimate reality, to the thing in itself, so to speak.
So science gives us a picture, a model, but it's not necessarily a complete or perfectly accurate representation of reality.
That's right. The practical success of science, its ability to predict and manipulate the world, that reflects its utility, its usefulness in navigating the phenomenal realm, the realm of our experience.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that our scientific models are perfectly aligned with the ultimate underlying reality, the noumenal realm.
Exactly. There's a fundamental limit to how much our cognitive structures can grasp about the ultimate nature of reality.
Okay, so we have these limits, but we're also constantly trying to understand the world, to make sense of it. And you mentioned this idea of the fundamental necessity of distinction through relation. What's the key insight there?
This principle, which teleosophy calls synaphionesis, is really fundamental. It basically says that all distinctions, all the differences we perceive and understand are inherently relational. They exist within a shared context.
Okay, help me understand that. What does it mean for distinctions to be relational?
Well, think about it this way. You can't define up without the implicit understanding of down. You can't define cause without effect. These concepts are defined in relation to each other. They're two sides of the same coin.
So it's saying that everything we identify as separate and distinct is actually part of a larger web of connections, and it only makes sense in relation to other things.
Exactly. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is defined and understood through its relationships with other things.
And this ties back to the integration of knowing and being, right? Because the
Yeah.
very act of distinguishing something, of creating a category, inherently creates a relationship with what it's not.
Precisely. We can't know something without also knowing what it's not. And this recognition of the relational nature of all distinctions is key to understanding how our cognition structures reality.
Wow, this has truly been a deep dive. I feel like my brain is doing backflips trying to process all of this. So let's try to summarize some of the key takeaways from this rapid analysis by ChatGPT. What are the core ideas that really stand out to you?
Okay, let's see. I think at its core, teleosophy is about this fundamental integration of epistemology and ontology, the idea that how we know and what exists are deeply connected, not separate. And this connection is driven by teleological action, the idea that our thinking is inherently purposeful and leads to action in the world.
And the crucial understanding of narrative cognition as the foundation of how we process information.
Absolutely. The idea that all human thought is structured as narratives, providing that essential framework for continuity, identity, and purpose.
And then all those fascinating ways, teleosophy reframes those big fundamental concepts.
Yeah.
Consciousness as a meta-epistemological inquiry, mathematics as this bridge between our cognition and the patterns of reality, more nuanced understanding of objectivity with its different levels.
And ethics grounded in the principle of reciprocal action, a functional view of the state focused on voluntary interactions, and this really interesting concept of God as our own inherent creative power.
And this significant shift from traditional metaphysics to meta-epistemology, focusing on how our own cognitive structures shape our experience of reality. And alongside that, this really important recognition of the inherent limits of our knowledge, this humility of science.
Exactly. And finally, that really key principle of syndiphonesis, the understanding that all distinctions are fundamentally relational and exist within a shared context.
It really does sound like teleosophy offers a potentially unifying framework, a way to connect and understand a wide range of inquiries through these core principles.
It's definitely ambitious in its scope.
It is. So, for you, the listener, a final thought. If our very understanding of reality is shaped by our purposeful action and the cognitive structures we employ, what new possibilities for knowledge and progress might open up when we become more aware of these underlying frameworks? It really makes you consider how teleosophy's insights might apply to your own areas of interest or the challenges you're currently navigating.
And I think this raises a really important question for everyone listening. If our minds are actively structuring reality through these narratives and purposeful actions, How can we become more intentional about the frameworks we use and the stories we tell ourselves? Because those stories, those frameworks, they have a real impact on how we live our lives and how we interact with the world.
Definitely something to ponder. If this deep dive into the core ideas of teleosophy, as seen through this rapid analysis, has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to explore further. There are resources available that delve into these concepts in much greater detail. It's a rich and developing framework, and we've only touched on the surface today. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Until next time.
See you then.